chapter 5. It's a little bit weightier of a scene. Sam has just had dinner with her college friend Tina, who lives in Seattle. They went to school in Chicago at Northwestern. And their dinner conversation and a phone call from Emily, referred to previously, have Sam thinking about the past. Later, after the dishes had found their way into the dishwasher and Tina had gone home, I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, my cat Chloe a purring mass at my side. When my brother first ran away to New York City, he'd spent his nights on park benches with other runaways, he told me later, mostly other gay kids. They turned tricks to eat and shot up to escape the nightmare of New York street life. Eventually, after one of his friends was murdered by a John, a social worker convinced Chris to go straight, so to speak, and he finished his GED and started taking classes part-time at NYU. A couple of years later, he met Ellen, his only serious boyfriend. But their relationship hadn't exactly been smooth. Ellen was older, HIV negative, and had lost many of his closest friends to AIDS in the early 90s, before HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy, I thought I was going to stumble in that, became available. Chris was not only infected with a strand of HIV that was resistant to several key heart drugs, but he'd also contracted hepatitis C during his street days. This combination was why he'd ended up getting so sick and dying at a time when most HIV-infected Americans could expect to live almost as long as those who weren't infected. Alan hadn't been able to handle Chris's many illnesses or murky long-term prognosis. He finally announced one day that he was moving home to the Twin Cities, alone. A short time after Alan left, Chris had called my parents for the first time in 7 years and asked if he could visit. I was a junior at Northwestern and took a few days off to meet him in Logan for the big family reunion. Emily was a high school senior then. That was the visit when I learned she had a scholarship to UW. Meanwhile, I didn't yet know that Chris was HIV positive or that he had recently lost the love of his life. He hadn't wanted us to worry, he told me later. I shut my eyes. Why was I thinking about my brother again? Was it because Emily had called? Would I flash back to Logan and to my family every time I talked to her? I wasn't sure why my guard came up so high and so fast with her, except soccer wasn't the only thing drawing me out. She was doing it too. Only I wasn't sure what that meant, and even less sure I wanted to face what it might mean. I didn't think I wanted to deal with the memories even the slightest contact with her seemed to trigger. Like now, my brain was working overtime, feeding wine-fueled memories to my conscious mind. One night in particular came back to me. Chris had already moved home to Michigan, basically to die. He and I were hanging out on the back porch watching the sunset when he mentioned our childhood visits to Binder Park Zoo. He'd always thought of New York City as a zoo for people like him, who didn't belong anywhere else, he told me. He was glad to be home, glad to be back among trees and grass where he could actually see the sky. He hadn't been able to breathe in New York. I reached over, touched his hand, and told him I was glad he was home too. We sat quietly holding hands, and it might have been the first time in our lives that we held on to each other like that. A week later, we were out on the back porch again watching an evening thunderstorm work its way through the neighborhood, flinching at the cracks of thunder and then laughing at our own fear. The storm was pretty bad, though nowhere near as powerful, we agreed, as the tornado that had ripped through Logan in '89, leaving the city's skyline permanently altered. We started reminiscing about walking around town after the all-clear sounded, inspecting shattered buildings and downed trees and power lines, and it occurred to me that this might be the last thunderstorm Chris would ever witness. How can you be so calm? I asked him, after a particularly deafening blast rattled the porch. He knew I wasn't talking about the weather. How else should I be, Sam? My liver is shot and my T cells are below 30. I'm not going to get any better. It's okay. I've had a long time to make peace with dying. But we haven't, I said. I haven't. I know, I'm sorry. His apology didn't change anything. I watched a bolt of lightning momentarily illuminate the evening sky, felt the thunder that followed a second later inside my body like the pulsing sound waves of a speaker. Beside me, Chris shut his eyes. He died 2 weeks later downstairs on the rented hospital bed on a lovely spring day. Our mother was holding his hand when he exhaled a last rattling breath and grew still. I stood in the den doorway, the tray of soup I held trembling slightly. She looked up at me, but I knew she didn't see me. He's gone, she said, her eyes and voice empty. The hospice nurse, Ben, moved to check Chris's vitals, to stop his IV, to close his eyes. He helped my mother up as her face crumpled and the sobs overtook her. Meanwhile, I stood there, still clutching the tray, unable to feel anything. I didn't cry until a week after I'd arrived in Seattle, on a warm morning when the scent of lilac bushes near my parked truck suddenly took me back to when I was a kid, sitting on the floor of Chris's room, right before he ran away, listening to him play guitar, the pungent fragrance of the lilac bushes outside his window enveloping us in a warm, sweet-smelling cocoon. That was how I had remembered my brother all those years he lived apart. And when I smelled the West Seattle lilacs after brunch with Tina, I sank to the sidewalk, wrapped my arms around my legs, and finally let go. Tina sat behind me on the cement and wrapped her arms around me, murmuring softly as the sobs tore through me, unrelenting. Now I squeezed my eyes shut tighter. Damn Chris. Damn him for running away, for going off and getting sick, for only coming home to die. We never got to see him healthy and happy, never got to meet the man he loved. I never got to have a real big brother. Instead, he left me with parents who couldn't look at me without seeing his ghost. I ground my fists against my eyes. I was tired of crying.